Hello and welcome back to bag B of the Tekno EB48 2.2 build. Today, as you can see, we are going to be working on our front and rear differentials. So just like in the last video, it's going to be a very, very similar process. In this bag, we are simply just repeating it twice here. So the first thing that we are going to go ahead and do, as per usual, is just kind of get everything opened up and ready to go. So you can see we're pulling out our different gaskets there, some pins, washers, and I will give you a heads up, these things can kind of be a pain in the butt to get out of the bag. As you can see, I am struggling a little bit here. And also, if you couldn't tell already, we are doing a voiceover for this one. So this one isn't live, this is a after the fact recording. So we are going to go over everything here in the back half. So bear with me a little bit if I make a mistake on what I'm saying, because obviously I'm not actively working on it. I'm watching the same video you are. So just like I was saying, get everything organized, get everything kind of spaced around, and that way you have a good idea of what you have, what you're working with. Sometimes, it's not super often, but sometimes there are things that are missing in the kit bags. So this is a good process to do. That way you know you've got everything and you know where it is. So you can see we are just about finished up getting organized here. We're gonna go ahead, get our gears set with each of our two differentials, and then we will go ahead and get started. So grabbing the manual here just to, again, have a reference. That way we know exactly what we're doing. We'll go ahead and get started now. So first thing we're going to do is just get some nice black grease onto our Outdrives. That way, and when they go into the diff cups, you have a good seal. They're nice and smooth. There's no friction, no binding at all. Go ahead, we'll get these two Outdrives taken care of. Don't put a crazy amount, but definitely don't be afraid to put some on there. The less friction, of course, the better. So we're gonna go ahead and get all of our Outdrives done here on the front half here. That way we just have kind of a baseline setup. And you'll see in the video that I'm not going super duper high on the Outdrive. I'm going just kind of to where the groove sits a little bit. When you go all the way in, you don't want the black grease to actually get into the oil in the diff. You just want to make sure that you're not going to have any bad friction in the ring gear or in the diff cup itself. So once we have that all finished up, we're going to go ahead and move on to our O-rings. Nothing fancy here. If you have specialty O-ring grease, you are welcome to use that. I like to just use the diff oil to get a little bit of lubrication on it, and then that kind of helps to seat it down in. And then in this case, as you can see, we do have some washers that sit on top of it. So that is going to allow us to use the washer to get even pressure to get it all the way down and seated onto that Outdrive. And I know on the back end of this, the view is not the most ideal, but of course, when you're recording, there's only so much you can see, but luckily we do get the main gist of it. So here we are just throwing the pin inside the Outdrive, getting that all seated in. It can be a bit of a pain in the butt, especially because it's a bit of a tight workspace. So that's all I'm doing there, is just getting everything seated and finalized. Now what we're going to do is, before we actually put any of our gears in the diff, I like to put a little bit of diff oil in the bottom of the cup. That way I know everything is nice and lubricated. Once you actually have everything built, you don't have to worry about doing that each time you rebuild the diff, because there will still be residual oil left. But obviously in this case, because everything is new, it's all dry, there's no oils or anything, so it's good to get lubrication down in there. Then you drop your gear on top and we start working on our planetary gears. So that'll be the small gears. So what I do first is I get the first two sat in, and then you can see I rotate the Outdrive just to get the teeth meshed together. Once I know that they are meshed, then we go ahead and throw the top half of our planetary gears in, and we can go ahead and get everything filled up. Now when you fill these up, you are just going for kind of above the cross pins. Because it's a brand new diff, you may have to go a little bit higher, and if you do put too much in, you can always wipe it out at the very end. So don't be afraid to put an OK mount in, but you don't need to fill it to where it's all the way to the top and level, because of course we are going to be putting another gear on top. Now that we have the kind of base oil in, I go ahead, spread it around with my 1.5 to get it into any of the crevices in the actual diff cup itself. As we know, there's different ridges in there for how it's all set up. So it's good to make sure that you get oil in all of those as well, just like how we got oil underneath the actual bottom sun gear. Now we have the bottom half of that diff built. Now we'll go ahead and start working on our second one. And the reason why I do this is because this gives an opportunity for any excess air bubbles to get worked out of that first diff. It allows for it to kind of get a true level, because again, we want oil to get into all the nooks and crannies. So as it sits for a little bit, that oil level can drop. So it's good to be able to let it kind of take a moment before you close it up and finalize. So just like in that first diff, we will start with putting a little bit of oil in the bottom side. In this case, I do opt for using some different oil than what the kit setup is, because as I said I believe it was bag A that I said it, potentially. If I didn't, I'm gonna follow a Wiggins base setup here just to kind of get a baseline, and I can definitely throw that down in the description. That way you guys have that reference. But in the grand scheme of things, the kit setup is probably gonna be just fine, especially for this very, very first build. So now we have the base oil in there, we have that lower gear in. We are going to get our bottom half of the planetary gears meshed in there. Now that those are meshed, we can go ahead and get our second half of those planetary gears. One thing that is nice about these diffs is the actual pins themselves that the planetary gears sit on are, they're keyed. So they're keyed not only in the middle for them to come together, but they're keyed on the outside too. So that way when they sit in the diff case, they sit nice and level, and you don't have to worry about the center key being off. So we'll go ahead, just like we did with that first diff, we'll go ahead, top it off, rotate the gears around a little bit, and then once everything is kind of filled for that first initial go, then we will set it off to the side and start letting that one bleed. Now that we are in the process of both diffs bleeding, instead of wasting time, we will go ahead and get the top half of our diffs taken care of, so the actual ring gear side, which is a very, very similar process to getting the bottom side done, but it is a little bit easier because you don't have to go as deep into a cup. Now we'll go ahead and grab our other ring gear. We're gonna get our O-ring nice and oiled up, and then we'll go ahead and place it onto the Outdrive and work on getting it seated into our ring gear. To help out with that, once again, we'll have that washer on top. That'll help us get some nice even pressure on it before we go ahead and slide the pin in. That will ultimately hold our ring gear and Outdrive together. Now that we finished up our top halves, we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna grab our oil, put it on our fingers, and then put just some oil on the diff gasket. That way we can set it into the ring gear. And sometimes it doesn't always work, but it does help to give it a little bit of stickiness. That way that gasket stays on and you don't have to worry about messing with it and it falling off on the back end. Like I said, it's not always going to work, but I try to give it as much help as possible. That way I don't have to line up a ring gear and a gasket all at the same time. The other thing that you'll see I do right here is obviously the front and rear diffs look very, very similar. So I like to put the oils that are in each of the diffs next to it. That way I know which diff is which. The other thing you can do is you can also mark with a silver Sharpie, F or R, again as an identifier to know what's front and rear. Now that we are gonna go and work on actually closing the diff, we put the sun gear on top, wipe off the extra oil, and we go ahead and start picking out the oil inside that pinhole. That way we don't have too much oil in our diff. We have the exact right level and we can go ahead and get closed up. So now from this point, it's just a matter of lining up the pin and the holes on the diff. And you can see I'll use my 1.5 to go through and just make sure that all 4 of those holes are lined up. And once they're lined up, then we can go ahead and close up. So a good rule of thumb is you can do a star pattern here. So go across rather than side to side. And because this has a metal gear on it, you can be a little bit more aggressive with the tightening. Obviously with the center plastic gear, if you go too tight on one or the other, you can actually warp the gear. But in this case, you can just go ahead and use that cross pattern, get everything nice and tight. And because it's a metal gear, it's not going to warp the diff at all. After you get it all closed up, give it a good twist, make sure that it's all in good shape, and then you can set it off to the side with your diff oil next to it, or again, you can mark it with that silver Sharpie. So same thing here, put the sun gear on top, wipe off the extra oil, put it on a rag, use that 1.5 to pick out the extra oil inside the pinhole. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's a little bit, but it's always good to set yourself up for the best possible outcome and for the most consistent outcome. So you can see this one's taking a little bit of time to pick all the oil out, but it's going to take time again on the front half rather than have an issue on the back half. Now we've got that all situated, make sure that gasket is still sat there correctly on top, and we can line up our screw holes and our pin, take the 1.5, just make sure everything is seated, and we can go ahead and start closing up our differential. Just like before, you're gonna go ahead and do that cross pattern, and you can go ahead and get this guy all tightened up. Couple more screws to do, and we are almost done with our second bag, getting those front and rear differentials built. Looks like we got one more screw getting ready to go in here. Give it that final twist. Again, I'm sorry you can't see it on the video, but there it is. That concludes our bag B, and we'll see you guys in the next one.